Good day and welcome to Window, your favorite podcast focusing on agriculture, development, business, and investment. I am Arrey Ivo from the African Center for Community and Development. In today's program, we shall be looking at why Africa is good for the private sector today. In the past, governments were in charge of most economies following the independence that African countries mostly obtained in the early 60s. And some governments even mediated economies by up to 70% and were the major determinants of interactions between these governments and foreign investors. Now the private sector is developing and growing and is generating up to 90% of Africa's jobs and two-thirds of its investments and 70% of its output. People living below the poverty line, which is about $1.24 per day, fell from 50% in 1981 to less than 45% in 2012. Despite this, we must also say that the fall is significant, but the number of people still living below the poverty line, or $1.24 a day, is still very, very wide. But this can be a way for investors to leverage on the gaps that these people face in the areas of education, healthcare, and infrastructure that the private sector is very good at doing. People are poor, but they need technical universities, vocational training centers, specialized health centers, and they also need roads and other transport systems to be able to carry their goods to ports or to the city centers and back. One major aspect of transformation that is needed, and that is something that shows that the private sector can benefit from Africa's situation, is agricultural transformation. It can really be a lucrative venture, as Africa has a middle class defined as those who earn up to $2 to $20 per day. And this number seems to be growing every day in the continent. It has grown to some 350 million people, 34% of Africa's population, up from 126 million in 1980, which was 27% of the population, compared with a growth rate of 2.6% of Africa's overall population. It has been projected that the middle class will reach 1.1 billion people in 2060. When that happens, we will have more consumers of television sets, refrigerators, mobile phones, automobiles, and a diverse set of products that one cannot list in this program. It must also be noted that consumer spending reached $1.3 trillion in 2010, which is about 60% of Africa's GDP, and it is projected to double by 2030. What does it tell us? It tells us that the private sector should be rushing to knock at Africa's door now. This is the time to set up the fish farms. The fish farms that are going to feed Africa's 1.2 billion people. The fish farms that are going to feed this population that may double by 2040 or 2050. The livestock keeping ventures that will feed this population. The waste and the rumen from these livestock keeping ventures can be mixed with waste in producing biogas. This is the moment to leverage on the green technologies within the African continent. This is the time to deal with water treatment, as many of Africa's population are living in urban areas. Many of these areas do not have good hygiene and sanitation facilities. These can be entry points for investment, for impact investment, for development management. Sometimes it is nice to say that there is still opportunity for aid in Africa, whereas there is a stronger role for business and partnerships in today's Africa. This is the time to recycle the wastes in Africa. It is the time for renewable energy generation. Africa must not only make use of its oil and gas, it must make use of its wind, its water. Being bounded by 3 oceans, Africa can do a lot of projects, desalination into fresh water. This is the opportunity for impact investors to see Africa as a way forward for an increase in global aggregate demand. And they must approach Africa with an understanding that they must work with Africans who have situational intelligence in the establishment of ventures that are win-win, not those ventures that come in with a template mentality of exploitation, of dubiousness, of capital flights, as Africa loses close to 50 billion US dollars on capital flights annually. So this is the moment for effective trade to take place in Africa. Viable joint ventures and partnerships between African individuals, organizations, NGOs, SMEs, with foreign investors. This is the moment to invest in infrastructure, schools, universities, hotels, and hospitals. Africa has one of the longest coastlines. Arguably, there are serious issues with the migration or the breaking down of homes in certain frontal or coastline communities, as these communities have been neglected, even though many do not have title deeds to their land, but ancestral land is far powerful than a piece of paper. But then there is a strong tendency, like in places like Lagos, to displace these people for more lucrative housing units, hotels, as well as low-cost housing along beach fronts. While this can be lucrative, the issue is there has to be movement towards compensation of people, and it has to be a willing process where people decide to leave the ancestral homes for other options that are provided by investors, as many of these communities are dependent on fisheries, and they constitute West Africa's 3 million fishermen and fishing-related livelihoods that account a lot for the GDP of these economies. But this is the time where the private sector can leverage from political reforms that have been happening in Africa. Africa has got participatory governance in many countries. There are elections that are regular in many countries, and some have been observed to be fair and free. And we recently have had elections in Rwanda, in Kenya, even though it is disputed. But then it is disputed within the framework of the law, which is another bonus as to a turn to African legal institutions for arbitration in conflicts in Africa. Now is the time to partake in regional security investments. Governments are coming together. Chad, Cameroon, and Nigeria came together in the fight against Boko Haram. There is a projection of closer ties between Equatorial Guinea and Uganda in the areas of oil and gas, as well as in security. There is structural transformation that has occurred in Uganda, South Africa, and Mauritius. This has helped to reduce too much occupational mobility from sectors like agriculture to other more lucrative sectors of the economy. This helps to stabilize the economy and to make sure that people can thrive where they are, and poverty does not affect only a segment of the population. The private sector can leverage from the diversification of African economies from non-oil economies, as well as participate in sustainable exploitation of newly discovered minerals in hotspots like Mozambique, Uganda, and Kenya. Infrastructure is something we must come back to, and we must see that according to the IMF, it has reached 59.4 billion, or 72.9% of total African financing in 2012, and infrastructural investments grew by 8% from 2011 to 2013, and energy by 5% over the same period. The transport sector had 41% allocation, and energy 37% of budgetary allocation between 2011 and 2013 from African governments. So there is an enabling environment from within Africa to transform African economies, as well as the private sector is also seeing the need to do this. Therefore, we must state that this is an opportunity for why Africa is good for the private sector today. The private sector is generating 90% of Africa's jobs, two-thirds of its investments, and 70% of its output. And the people living below poverty line are falling down. There are no longer so many people like in 1981, where 50% of the population was living below $1.24 per day. And today, or just a few years ago, 2012, it was just 45% of Africa's population. And transformation, we have touched, is very important because the goods that are going to come out of transformation can be consumed by Africa's 350 million people who are now termed as middle class and living with $2 to $20 per day. And we have also seen that spending has reached $1.3 trillion in 2010, which is 60% of Africa's GDP, and it is projected to double by 2030. This is the opportunity for investments in Africa. Thank you very much for tuning in onto Window at the African Center for Community and Development. It has been Arrey Ivo.